Hello, my name is Ekaterina. I'm glad to see you on my channel, and today I'm going to tell you about seam allowances. Right now, there's a fairly common belief among beginners that all seam allowances are 1 centimeter. That is, we take our pattern piece, lay it out on the fabric, add 1 centimeter on all sides, and that's it. These are my seam allowances. In reality, they are different in various areas, and this is very, very important. The seam allowances you leave will ultimately dictate how you end up carrying out each specific operation when sewing your garment. And accordingly, the result of that operation will also be very, very different. So please pay close attention to where and what kind of seam allowances we need to have. I'll simply be demonstrating using this specific front piece as an example. The front piece features a clearly marked center line and a front edge line. It appears quite clearly that a placket or facing is intended for this section. We have the neckline, the shoulder, the armhole, and the bust dart, which has been carefully shifted over to the side seam, followed by the side seam itself and the hemline. Now, let's begin our work by focusing on the front edge line. In a theoretical sense, a facing or a placket should be carefully attached right here. However, if you find that the fabric you are using is very thin or delicate, then we should leave exactly a 0.5 centimeter of extra space along the front edge line to ensure a professional and clean finish for the garment. So I'll just write 0.5 like this. If the fabric is more densely woven or perhaps a bit looser, well, we have to ask what the term thin actually implies here. For these thinner coat fabrics, we should leave a margin of 0.7. If you are worried about leaving just 0.5 here, then you can leave 0.7 instead. If you are working with a thin fabric, you should understand that you will end up trimming away all of that extra material anyway. So I'll imagine that here I have some kind of thin fabric after all. I'll carefully mark it out starting from 0.5 centimeter. That's exactly 0.5 along the neckline. There might be a collar here, a stand-up, turn-down collar, or maybe just a simple round neckline like this. For this neckline and for attaching the collar, we leave the same seam allowance as we do along the front edge. So if I took 0.5 here, assuming the fabric is thin, then accordingly it will also be 0.5 here. For now, I'll mark it with a dashed line first, and then I'll draw it out. If your fabric is loosely woven and you took 7 millimeters along the front edge, then you should take that same amount, follow along the edge of the neckline and the shoulder. But for the shoulder, you need to make sure to leave a little bit more space, about 2 to 2.5, or even 3 centimeters extra. You can trim that excess fabric away later, but if you're sewing your very first garment, even with a tried and true pattern, how exactly is that garment going to turn out, and how will the fabric behave in the finished piece? Well, that's something that's actually quite difficult to predict with certainty, and when you see your shoulder line in the finished garment, you might find yourself wanting to reposition that shoulder seam line just a little bit closer to the front or the back. This is done simply to make that line look more attractive. Sometimes you need to take the fabric in a bit here at the armhole and let it out at the back. Or you might do the exact opposite. That is why you should leave a larger seam allowance at the shoulder here of 2.5 centimeters. That is certainly a very solid and reliable option. Moreover, sometimes it happens that we really need to take something in from the front or let out the back a bit. That is why we always leave a little bit of additional material at the shoulders and then trim off the excess, specifically because we're doing custom sewing. At the factory, everything is already set in place. And the neck allowance is set according to the specific machinery and equipment that will be used when sewing the garment. Here it's more of a creative process, and right here at the shoulders, it's very important to leave extra allowance. Now, as for the specific area of the armhole, that is exactly where you can certainly leave some extra seam allowance as well. In this particular spot, you can leave 1 centimeter or perhaps 1.5 centimeters, but absolutely no more than that. Even if you plan to make some minor changes to the armhole later on, if you leave too much fabric here, you physically will not be able to properly baste and sew in the sleeve. It's a concave line like this, and the sleeve cap is also shaped like this at first. So the sleeve also has a rather complex shape. If we have very large sleeve caps here, meaning large seam allowances, we simply won't be able to do anything here physically. I do not typically leave just 1 centimeter. Instead, I prefer to leave exactly 1.5 full centimeters. First, I mark it with a dashed line clearly like this. Then I'll make this line really quite solid. I didn't label it. So here we leave 2.5 centimeters. And then I write excess. Then cut off. Follow along the edge of the armhole. You should use 1.2 centimeters, or if the fabric is very dense, 1.5. And yes, it is important to remember to also cut off the excess later. Actually, you can even use these 1.2 centimeters for both thicker, dense materials and looser fabrics. If you are already dealing with a traditional set-in sleeve design where there is a lot of ease and an intricate shape of the sleeve cap, then of course everything must be sewn there. It is not like you can simply skip checking it on a mock-up. That is absolutely certain. It is important to remember that everything is checked thoroughly on the mock-up, but even so, we still leave a few extra millimeters just in case. And then we trim off the excess and also this seam allowance. At exactly 1.2 centimeters, it is actually very convenient for us when we are finishing up the edges with an overlocker machine. Those 1.5 to 2 millimeters that you trim off right at the very edge of your seam allowances with the overlocker look really, really nice. So it turns out neater and easier than running the blade right along the edge of the fabric itself. The edge, and there, 0.5 millimeter to the left or right, and there might be some overlock stitches hanging somewhere. But if you carefully run your overlocker machine along the edge and neatly trim away just those last couple of millimeters, it makes the whole process much easier for you to manage, of course. When we sew using tried and true patterns, and we have a simple garment like a shirt made from thin fabric, for example, we leave the same seam allowance at the sides, the same amount as for the armhole. So I'll write it down like this, 1.2. If we're sewing something from outerwear and let's say we're feeling quite confident in the model, but when we actually start fitting, not just the mock-up, but the real garment itself, we begin trying it on with many different options. Perhaps with a skirt, or with pants, or with various types of underlayers. We might try it on with a turtleneck, or perhaps with something much bulkier, like a button-down shirt, or a thin sweater, or even a very thick sweater. In this specific case, we really need to see how we fit into this construction through the armhole area. So yes, it is definitely better to leave a larger seam allowance here for now, and then, if it becomes necessary later, we can simply trim off the excess. Here I'm taking 2.5. Accordingly here as well, 2.5. And notice here, I'm carefully drawing it out perfectly parallel, just like this. And here I end up with a seam allowance for the dart. We do not actually cut out the dart. It remains in place as a triangular wedge shape. If, for example, the fabric is exceptionally thick and dense, then the dot is absolutely meant to be there. Sometimes after the dart has already been stitched, the seam allowance is trimmed off afterwards. Alternatively, if the fabric is very thin and semi-transparent, then the dart is also stitched first, and then the remaining excess seam allowance is trimmed off. I'll outline it. Well, I'll label it here as well, either 1.2 or 2.5. Well, right now I actually have it set to 1.2 right here. And pay attention so that later, when pressing open the seam allowances, they lie flat and even. The seams. The way I usually do it is this. I draw a much longer line right here, and here it is. When I am ready to make the seam allowance, I carefully lay the ruler parallel to this very last segment and see exactly where it will end up. And here, as you can clearly see, the line doesn't actually go out this way at all. I'll show you with a pencil now. It's a big mistake when the line is drawn out like this. When a garment might not have a lining, you press the seam open, and then, for example, this edge doesn't end up inside the collar, meaning the neckline. So what do? We need to catch the direction of the line. After all, it comes out right here. So right here we have the specific angle of it. Here comes the turn in a corresponding manner. And here as well, I bring it out into this turn because here we have the seam allowance, depending on how it goes. This way, when you turn it out, it will come out symmetrically. From this line, I extended this little corner here as a continuation, and here as a continuation as well. Well, right here, I showed it with a little flower, and downwards, if we have it available, it will look like this. Maybe some kind of button-down shirt, or for example, perhaps a thin dress. Actually, no, not a dress. Definitely not. Well, so if we happen to have, for example, a shirt, then we can use this one, this whole one, 2/10. If we have a thin, lightweight dress, a lightweight dress. And it's flared, meaning the skirt is a flared half circle. I am writing down that if the bottom is flared, we will not be able to hem much, but we can fold it just a little bit, for example, with these kinds of thin seams. Yes, that's possible, but if it's something ordinary, like a light summer dress made of cotton or something similar, then you can hem 1.5 to 2 centimeters, depending on how flared it is, just as much as you can fold nicely, about 1.5 to 2 centimeters. If it's not an ordinary one, well, if it's a straight line, just like the one I have here, then you can hem it quite nicely. 3.5 or even 4 centimeters. A wide hem looks beautiful. It's up to you. So those are roughly the numbers. And if we're talking about, say, a jacket or a coat, then for those specific cases, 4 centimeters is the standard hem width. And let's imagine that, for example, I have a jacket right here in front of me and I am going to mark out exactly 4 centimeters. But when you are sewing heavy outerwear, and even when working on a mock-up, you have already rehearsed how much material you need for everything, right? Still, when you finally have the actual physical garment made up in the real fabric, and you start fitting it with a variety of different hem options, sometimes you put it on and suddenly realize, oh, if only it were just a little bit longer than it actually is right now. That's why down here, sometimes I allow for 6 or 7 centimeters in addition to this hem right over here, so that there is kind of a margin for creativity if the piece of fabric you have allows for it. No. When we have such wide seam allowances like these, so that we have one piece lying down flat, and we trace the outline of the piece itself, then we trace the outer outline of the seam allowance as well. We also have a second piece. For example, when we are cutting the fabric. So, in order not to forget that our seam allowances are different, especially where we have such wide seam allowances, usually notches like these are made on the darts on both sides so that you know at what point to start basting. In other words, a guide is usually placed here and here as well, so that when you are stitching the dart, you should sew the dart as in line 200, like this. And right here, make sure to create clear marks that you will need to align later on. Now, regarding the construction of the dart, if you press the dart allowance downward, you will end up with a bit of excess seam allowance. If you carefully press the fabric in an upward direction, you might find that it occasionally happens that, just in case the extra seam allowance material ends up tucked into the side seam, just in case something goes wrong during the process. So this is what I do. I divide this distance in half, and then from right here, I'm going to add it just like this. About another 1.5 centimeters. Okay, well, it's not perfectly even, but that's not important here. All right. So what I'm going to do is carefully aligning this point and this edge here when it's folded together, when these parts are constructed. I'll just even it out later along the bow line. But here, it's always better to leave yourself some extra material to work with so you don't have to worry about it. Now then, I have the front piece on the back with the same seam allowances. We also still have, like, for example, the collar and the sleeve and the facing as well. What seam allowances will they have? I'm not going to draw out these details here right now because we already have a clear visual indication on the drawing right here. So we need to determine which specific parts connect to one another and along which exact edge. That is where the seam allowance stays the same. So for example, if I have the entire facing, let's say here is my facing, for the facing, the seam allowance along the edge will be the same as on the front piece. The seam allowance along the neckline will also be the same as on the front piece. Now the bottom edge. It's better to cut it out just straight for now, and then it will be finished later. And the line where, for example, the lining will be attached, here you can give a 1 centimeter allowance for the lining. 1 centimeter. The sleeve. Next, for the armhole, 1.2 centimeters. Accordingly, the sleeve along the sleeve cap will also have 1.2 centimeters. Now, for the width of the sleeve, you can do it like this. So, for example, right here at the side, we have 2.5 centimeters. Accordingly, we will give that exact same amount to the sleeve as well, just in case there is a need to widen it later on, our garment a little, or the sleeve. Following this same logical process, we can make it wider by increasing the measurement of its width. That is, the very same principle of adjustment applies to the sleeve, specifically to the opening section at the bottom of the sleeve. It's the same story, 4 centimeters. I'm not writing here that it's not 4 centimeters, but yes, I do have 4 centimeters here. And at the bottom of the sleeve, the same 4 centimeters, plus you need to add another 2 to 3 centimeters to the sleeve to allow for extra. Just in case you might want to raise the shoulder line a little bit higher, or maybe you will find that you want a more voluminous shoulder pad. Or, for example, if you try on the garment with the bottom layer and the whole construction shifts up a bit, God forbid you end up with sleeves that are too short. So, because of that, here I write sleeve, and then I will add a bit extra to the total length. 2 to 3 centimeters. And the very last thing I will tell you today is the specific way that we store our patterns, whether they are with seam allowances or without them. If your pattern is brand new and you have not sewn anything with it just yet, it is much better for this particular pattern to be without any seam allowances. You will add seam allowances when cutting out the mock-up or the actual garment. If you make any adjustments to the pattern, then you can add them at that point. It's easier to make these changes to the paper pattern when there are no seam allowances. If the pattern has been thoroughly tested and you find yourself sewing with this specific pattern quite often, for example, basic t-shirts, comfortable loungewear, everyday pants, or even sports shorts, basically if you have similar items and you use this pattern repeatedly, it makes a lot of sense to add permanent seam allowances to this pattern. That way, you'll be able to sew much faster in the future. And be sure to clearly label each individual pattern piece as either having seam allowances or being without them. Personally, I still prefer to store my own patterns without any seam allowances and simply add them manually when I am laying out the fabric. But this is really a personal choice, a matter of taste, whatever is more convenient for you. There is no single right or wrong way here. Everyone does it the way they like best. That's all. I'll say goodbye to you now. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel and give it a like. With that, I'll be saying goodbye. All the best to everyone and much success to you all. Goodbye.